Good evening, good afternoon, yes. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the RIBA and to the 2020 Royal Gold Medal crit. I must admit, I haven't used the word crit in Queen's University for quite a number of years. We talk about design reviews. So, yes, maybe this is the last year it gets called a crit. Yeah. My name is Alan Jones, and as president of the RIBA, I have the pleasure of hosting and chairing today's event. Since it was first delivered in 2006 as a collaboration between the awards and the education teams at the RIBA, the crit, that word again, has become an established annual event that brings together the winners of our most prestigious prizes. The RIBA President's Medals in the Dissertation, Bronze and Silver categories, and the Royal Gold Medal. 2 months ago, I had the pleasure of awarding the 2019 RIBA President's Medals to 4 talented graduates here at the RIBA. Today, we have a unique opportunity to hear them presenting their accomplished work. Each presentation will be appraised by our panel that has, as our guests of honour, I should have asked the students to stand up. Students, would you like to, the graduates, the winners of the medals, so people know where they are in the room, yeah? I'll be better at this next year, okay? Each presentation by our President's Medals winners will be appraised by our panel that has, as our guests of honour, Yvonne Farrell and Shelley McNamara of Grafton Architects. Who, in just a few hours, along with everybody else from Grafton Architects, I will have the honour of awarding the 2020 Royal Gold Medal. By way of an introduction, Yvonne and Shelley are the co-founders of Grafton Architects, which was established in Dublin in 1978 and has been responsible for the design of an outstanding range of buildings that have made Grafton Architects well-deserved winners of this year's Royal Gold Medal. Examples of Grafton's work include the School of Economics of the Luigi Bocconi University in Milan, the Department of Mechanical Engineering of Trinity College Dublin, the Medical School of the University of Limerick, winner of the RIBA European Award and shortlisted for the Sterling Prize in 2013. The new campus for the University of Engineering and Technology in Lima, Peru, winner of several awards, including the inaugural RIBA International Prize in 2016. Last month, Grafton completed the townhouse for Kingston University, just west of here, their first building in the UK. Home to a library, dance studios and a theatre, the building was described in one of its many glowing reviews as a love nest, where students can find books and romance. A wonderful way to describe the function of the building. If that doesn't make a compelling case for post-occupancy evaluation, then I don't know what does. But in all seriousness, the townhouse is an example of how Grafton's work is best described as a celebration of the principles of humanity and generosity. This is visible not only in their buildings, but also in the way they present their work in lectures, exhibitions, and publications, inspiring audiences all over the world. During his introduction to yesterday's Royal Gold Medal lecture, Hugh Campbell, professor at University College Dublin, very aptly and poetically summed up Grafton's work as an orchestrated coordinates between people and buildings. Anyone who was able to witness their lecture last night, either in person or online, I would point out, at the RIBA, or visited their buildings can vouch for that. In this year's panel, we also have Nikki Watson, RIBA Vice President for Education. Nikki, stand up. Yay. Sorry, I lost my place. Nikki Watson, RIBA Vice President for Education. I'm trying to think of what to say about. Nikki is also not from London, like me. She's from the northeast, from Newcastle way, yeah? And also an elected council member, and was also a member of the 2019 Bronze and Silver Medal judging panels. We are also joined by Professor David Gloucester, RIBA Director of Education, who chaired the same two judging panels. And I'm delighted to also have with us today Sally Stewart, head of the Mackintosh School of Architecture and a member of the 2019 Dissertation Medal judging panel. I am very grateful to Nikki, David, Sally for their hard work they put in selecting last year's winners and for joining us today. I should also point out that we have a number of presidents of other institutions who have, I have joked with them already, have opted for the back of the bus. They're at the back. And we have presidents from America, from Korea, and elsewhere here today. So a fantastic audience. The structure of the crit, that word again. The event, yeah, is as follows. Each medalist will have up to 15 minutes. I have checked, and some are saying, Alan, it might go over by 30 seconds. And I'm going, yeah. Again, the event yesterday with presidents, I kept them to their 3 minutes or thereabouts. So maybe the odd little tiny bit beyond 15. But that eats into the time that you've got for comments, which should be around 5 to 10 minutes. Obviously, I will be encouraging our guests of honour to be making the presentation or to making the initial comments. And I would ask all to try and use the microphones, not just because we're recording the event, but also that people at the back of the room can also hear. So that's the format. And then at the end, we will open the floor to comments, okay? We will start with Ruth Burrows, a Part 2 graduate from the University of Westminster, winner of the 2019 Dissertation Medal with her work, Ages Through the Terrace, the evolving impact of age on social and spatial relations in the home. Ruth, the floor is yours. Your 15 minutes starts now.
Okay. Our perception of age is malleable. How old someone feels, looks, and acts is both subjective and fluid. Also, the cultural significance of age groups, so how they're defined and represented, and their rights and obligations are constantly evolving and historically unique. Yet over the last few centuries, chronological age has been increasingly used as a tool to organise our society, and our cities and our country have become increasingly age segregated. A previous study I completed on retirement villages concluded by challenging the social value and outdated presumptions of creating pockets of the over 55s in largely rural and suburban areas, and prompted the simple question of how the young and the old may live together in the city. And today, following decades of a trend for more dispersed generations, the crises in housing and care provision are meaning that families are having to pool resources and live together for longer. Notably, the multifamily home was the fastest growing house type of 2017. Therefore, this dissertation set to think about how numerous generations could be negotiated under one roof and examine how society's shifting understandings of age have impacted on the organisation, the material culture, and the everyday use of the home. So the dissertation is structured on 3 historic case studies, each of which examine an individual terraced house in Hackney and envisage how a specific real family once lived within it. So the timings of the case studies were chosen to correspond with key points in history when new concepts of age groups first popularised in society. So the Georgian new understandings of childhood, the Victorian more rigid definitions of old age, and the post-war mass marketing of the teenager. and to allow the case studies to be appropriately compared, all the families selected were white, British, middle class and Christian, and the information on the families was gathered from historic documents largely in Hackney and London Metropolitan Archives. And here other documents such as diaries, letters, household inventories of other local residents gave a wider sense of the lived experience of family life at the time. So the first case study is centred on the Underhill family, who were one of the many middle-class families to move to the parish of Hackney at the end of the 18th century. And at this time, society's understanding of age was vague and pliable. There seemed to be numerous ways to split the life course into stages, and the timings of key life transitions, such as entry into education, marriage, and the period of employment, seemed to vary greatly from individual to individual. Chronological age was rarely used to characterise an individual's identity, and even still in 1833, the Factory Act stipulated proof of age by physical appearance. So in 1790, the Underhill household consisted of the married couple Samuel and Elizabeth, Samuel's elderly widowed mother Sarah, their 5 children, a lodging apprentice and 2 maids. And of the 8 children that were born in the terrace, only 5 survived into adulthood. And whilst one daughter left the family home at 17, the other remained in it until her marriage at 35. One son never left the family home, whilst the other returned to it following the death of both his wife and daughter. And this seemingly chaotic and changeable household was actually typical of Georgian London in a context of high mortality and high migration. So despite the unpredictability of households, the domestic architecture of Georgian London was built with unprecedented standardisation and solidity. Yet the indeterminate spatial geometries allowed for the functions and significance of rooms to typically vary over the course of the year, week and day. And the isolation of the stair court allowed the separate apartments of the terrace, such as the widows and the lodgers, to be independently and privately accessed. And this would have been particularly important for Sarah Underhill, who would have placed a premium on maintaining a sense of spatial autonomy in old age. Significantly, she had her own maid and most likely controlled her lockable chamber door. And this reflects the wider societal benefits for the elderly, such as parish support and a demand for domestic crafts, which meant that they were far from reliant on or subservient to their adult children. So the rooms of the Underhill's terrace would have been simple paired-back spaces. In the 18th century, there were few age-specific furnishings, and for instance, the Underhill children's bedchambers would likely have been furnished with redundant adult-sized pieces too worn for the downstairs rooms of the home. And this reflected the common belief that childhood was to be outgrown at all possible speeds, and their bedchambers were viewed as temporary spaces to harden children. It would have been typical if the Underhill children's and the lodgers' spaces made use of the Georgian vast market of metamorphic furniture, such as fold-down beds. Notably, the permanence of one's bed reflected their status in the life cycle. So in the 18th century, there were also few age-specific domestic pursuits, and adults, children and the elderly all shared meals, parlour games and other entertainments within the common parlour. Bedtimes were less dictated by age and more by the high candle tax, and it would have been typical if on the disappearance of daylight the entire Underhill family retired to bed at the same time. Notably, the provision of separate bedchambers for children and adults was a relatively new custom in the 18th century. And so household habits made for the mixing of generations, as conversation at home was thought a key part of a child's education, and medical writers actually prescribed the material transfer of cheerfulness from the young to the old, saying it would secure a long and vigorous old age. So the second case study introduces the Dundas family, who moved into a terrace overlooking the newly opened Victoria Park in 1870. And the institutionalisation of segments of society in Victorian London made the kind of definitions of age groups more definite. Chronological age increased in social importance, and notably birthday celebrations became commonplace. And this is one of the many birthday lists I found in Victorian diaries. And so over the course of the century, new legislation excluded children from labour and compelled them into education and enforced the retirement of the elderly. Hence, chronological age became a basis for an individual's rights and responsibilities, freedoms and restraints. So in 1870, the Dundas household consisted of the married couple Mary and Robert, Mary's elderly widowed mother Janet, their 5 children and a single maid. And this lack of lodgers reflects the Victorian ideal for an insular family home and the preference of boarding houses for the middle-class youth. And so the more rigorous organisation of society is mirrored in the segmentation and specialisation of the spaces within the home. So the Dundas Terrace contained a greater variety of scale and shape of rooms than the Underhills, and each now housed a specific activity and household member. There was now a dignified and distinct space for adults and children, man and wife, the elderly and the infirm. It was no longer deemed appropriate for mothers to sleep with babies, for older children with younger ones, and older boys and older girls. And the more remote an individual's private spaces, the lower their status in the household. Notably, the elderly widow occupied a less prestigious place than the Dundas children. And this reflects how the curbing of poor relief, demise of domestic crafts, and the threat of workhouse confinements made elderly relatives increasingly viewed as a burden on family life and decreased their power and their position within the home. And so the letterbooks of Victorian wallpaper companies show clear trends in the colours and the patterns that were used to decorate the different spaces of age groups. So the paler colours of the nursery and the rich flocks of the dining room. Also, there became an array of available furnishings and objects designed specifically with children in mind. And also in Victorian London, death in old age now surpassed that in childhood, and the growing concerns over health and hygiene began to influence the bedchambers of elderly individuals. And that of Janet Forbes would have greatly differed from her adult daughters. It's likely that carpets were replaced by stained wooden floors, textured wallpaper made way for painted walls, and plush fabrics lost for unupholstered furniture. So the introduction of oil lamps in the Victorian homes extended the evening and created different bedtimes for adults and children. Specialised diets were now prescribed for the young and the old, and with the rise in commuting to work, adults now ate later than children who took their meals separately within the nursery. Notably, the invitation for an older child to join the adults of the family for regular meals was thought a key moment in their maturity. And so the decrease in infant mortality and the demise of the apprenticeship system for the middle classes meant that Victorian parents could now witness their children grow up within their own home, and they became viewed as symbols of moral investment. Fueled by the horrors of the factory system, children were now believed to be born innocent, only corrupt by experience of the adult world. And much of their time was contained within the nursery, as they were thought to suffer outside it. And children were only granted brief appearances to the adult spaces of the home to introduce coming-of-age topics and on special occasions. So the final case study introduces the Joneses family, who moved into a compact terrace in a post-war housing estate in 1970. And by mid-20th century, life had become structured into 3 main acts. The first centred on education and preparation, the second on employment and family building, and the final one on retirement. And this so-called tripartite life course became a dominant factor in the rebuilding of our cities following the Second World War. In a 1950 speech, the then health minister spoke of the 3 ages of man, proposing 3 different forms of housing for the childless young, married couples with children, and the elderly. And this clear agenda of providing each phase of life with a new housing typology promoted the shrinking and nuclearisation of the family home. And notably, from the 1960s, the UK witnessed a dramatic rise in the number of elderly individuals living alone, sustained by the availability of outpatient care, state pensions, and specialised housing. So in 1970, the Jones family consisted of the married couple Joseph and Frida and their 2 children, representing the post-war ideal for a self-sufficient nuclear home. And the reduced working week and the loss of domestic staff made parents less remote, and the relationships between adults and children in the home became more open and casual. And this changing power relations and post-war ideal for family togetherness became materialised in the modern democratic house plan. This can be seen in the Joneses Terrace, where the ground floor activities of eating, cooking, relaxing and studying were no longer contained within individual rooms, but were zones within a single open space. And by the Second World War, the birth rate had fallen below that needed to sustain a level population, and domestic architecture became focused on easing child rearing. In the Joneses Terrace, Frida would have been allowed a view through the French doors to the children playing in the back lawn, and a deep hallway cupboard was perfectly dimensioned to fit a pushchair. And children were an accepted and central presence in post-war downstairs living spaces, cemented by the advent of children's TV in the middle of the century. And this also will have helped shape household patterns, and it would have been typical if the 9 o'clock watershed signalled the bedtime for the Joneses' young boy. And the provision of central heating in the terrace would have allowed members of the family to disperse if they so wished. And as a 15-year-old girl, I expect much of Margot's time will have been spent held up in her bedroom. So the post-war extension of the schooling age and higher education prolonged the dependency of young individuals on their parents and threw a spotlight on the conflicted state of adolescence. And in the 1960s and 70s saw a rise in youth and gang culture, and much of domestic life became about containing teenage leisure. It became convention to provide your teenage child with a multifunctional bedsit to listen to music and hang out with friends. And adolescence was now accepted as a time of identity building and experimentation, and it would have been typical if Margot used her room to materially express her emerging identities, recording past event, current passions and future ambitions. It's likely that childhood toys sat amongst posters of idolised pop groups and teenage magazines. So the concluding chapter of the dissertation revisits the three terraces of the case studies. The current residents were contacted and their homes visited as they explained their own family's use of the space. And this sits alongside a discussion of the future of the multi-generational homes and the domestic experiences and expectations of age groups today, particularly looking at those of young adults and the elderly, and exploring issues of spatial autonomy, boundaries and identity building at a time when dependence is no longer achieved at 16 and decline no longer begins at 60. Thank you. Do I?
I'm trying to use the microphones here so that everybody can hear and we can record. 14 minutes. Well done. To encourage some comments from our guests and from also particularly from Sally in reviewing. Maybe Sally, maybe you start with what made this win the medal?
Well, I think I would just pick up on a point that Alan made earlier about terminology. And while this is the dissertation medal we're talking about, I think what we're looking at is research. And that maybe this should be called the Student Research Medal in future, because the quality of what's being produced and the depth and insight that are emerging through these documents, it really is phenomenal and would match most of the things that are in the RIB bookshop at the moment. So I have to say that first of all. I think one thing that as a panel, we were really blown over by the two dissertations in particular. Part of it was about the design, the foresight in actually planning this piece of research and designing the probes that went into this. And I think what's really interesting in Ruth's work, and I would like to ask her about, is about my sense of the developing spatial autonomy that people expect within the homes now, that you name, you describe the kind of rites of passage that have changed over time. Children now having much bigger say in space, or teenagers demand, or even people living in their 20s and 30s on their own. So I'm really interested in kind of the atomization of space and the kind of requirements that architects are now intended to anticipate when they're looking at living spaces now and spatial connections to that.
Okay. Was that a question or a comment?
Yeah.
Sorry.
Do you have thoughts on that as a designer yourself?
Well, I think the research showed to me that there's a long-standing history of, as we age, we gain more spatial autonomy. So kind of key points, like for the Georgian, a child was given a little locking box to provide them with their first sense of privacy at the age of 7, or whether in Victorian, giving the key to the door at 21. And I think today, that's one of the reasons why many young adults feel quite suffocated and frustrated when they're having to move back to the family home, because I think leaving the family home is a kind of culturally significant step and spatial progression when growing old. So I think as a designer, it's kind of thinking about how we're failing this generation at the moment of young adults who can't find secure or affordable rents. And yeah, I think that was something that I picked up on in the conclusion about the need to have or feel like we're progressing spatially as we age.
So I think that's really clear in your conclusions. And I think the other thing that you've also picked up on is the kind of very long life, loose fit to some of these dwellings, and actually the affordances that they have in them. And it's up to us to imagine how we can use them in the future as well.
The difference between, I guess, the Georgian terrace, there wasn't a predictable family structure, as I kind of made clear. And you can see how the spaces were based on kind of abstract geometries and classical proportions, which meant they didn't determine a specific use or function. And in the household inventories, I looked at the Georgian terraces. They described the objects in the room by the location of that room in the terrace, compared to the Victorian, where they were labelled dining room, drawing room, and things were designed for specific activities. And when I revisited the post-war functionalist house, you could see how it had been designed around the nuclear family and the hierarchical bedrooms of a master bedroom and 2 box rooms. And now the family, it was actually 2 parents, a 28-year-old and a 24-year-old child, who were having to cram their belongings into these tiny box rooms, and which had actually become redundant, whereas the Georgian household terrace was serving its family much more. And you can see over its history, like kitchens have become bedrooms and bedrooms have become bathrooms. The ground floor has become a shop. It just was remaining relevant to society's changing understandings of age and family structures, whereas I think the post-war one was very much of its kind of time in the family structures and needs then. Sorry.
I'm just conscious that we have 2
I know I'm rambling.
experts on Georgian Dublin with us, Yvonne and Shelley.
I'd just like to thank you. Is this working? Or do I turn it on? Is it okay? Working? Yep. Okay. Just to congratulate you on a fantastic piece of work, and the clarity with which you take the various eras and see it, and really questions what's going on today. When we were choosing samples of contemporary housing, because we have a really big housing crisis in our country, we chose one of a beautiful scheme in Helsinki, which by a local architect, where she actually chose to make the floor-to-ceiling height 5 meters high, and it meant that you could have it as a studio, you could have it with 2 bedrooms, no bedrooms, with 3 bedrooms. And what's really fantastic about your work with the clarity with which you compare each of the eras, that when we relate space totally to function, so-called functional understanding or social understanding, that it limits itself. Yeah. And as our president has just said there now, that in terms of Georgian architecture, when you clearly separate out the staircase in the Georgian structure, you then have possibility. It reminds me also of the beautiful project here in Winscombe Street by Niamh Brown, where he was really checking the terrace as in its own history. And by virtue of the narrow, I think it's 13 feet wide. And what's interesting about the entrance, because of section, it was for children living and parents, but it meant that children could have an independent usage. as time happens. I'd just like to say that it is amazing that people are living longer, you know, like in watching ads on television, you know, once you reach 55, you have to kind of make sure that you have everything organized for your doomsday. So what's really amazing in your research is that people are living longer. First of all, congratulations on your award, that you begin your life with such a clear way of research, that it is really important because people have to understand that we make mistakes by being too precise. It's the loose fit. I lived in a Georgian house on Merrion Square back in the 1970s, and the staircase was amazing. And Shelley and I have an artist, a friend, who lives in what was a palace in Henrietta Street in Dublin. She lives in the house alone, but in its heyday, it had 102 people, or 120 people, I think, living in the building. Awesome. Wow. Great time. But congratulations on your achievement. It will rest with me. I will think about what you have researched, and I thank you deeply for what you have achieved.
I was going to invite David and Nikki, if you have comments, reflections. Speak to the microphone, Nikki. Sorry.
I believe we have a new housing minister, or are soon to have a new housing minister. I haven't quite heard the news yet.
We've lost one.
We've lost one. I don't know whether we've got a new one yet. And I was just interested that if you could have 5 minutes with a new housing minister, whether any of your learnings, or what from your learnings from this research project that you might want to put under their nose in terms of how they might be wanting to think about future housing in this country?
I think I would encourage more diversity and them to reflect the kind of moving away from the standard nuclear family type to reflect our society, and to be able to better in terms of the multi-generational home. At the moment, I feel most houses fail to accommodate 2 adult generations. There's normally a hierarchy in the space. So I think providing for different house types and really questioning our conceptions on family structure and what a house needs to do, because over the last few decades our living patterns have dramatically changed. Kind of how and where we play, and how we work and working in the home, various things, and technology as well, issues of privacy. I think the home still falls back on set rooms and set layouts that maybe aren't quite as up to date with our changing society. Does that make sense? Sorry.
Yes, yes, please.
I agree with Yvonne. I think the focus of your dissertation is fantastic, and the simplicity of being able to talk about candlelight and oil lamps and central heating and the effect this has on the way that we live. But it reminds me of a wonderful essay by Robin Evans, and I can't remember the title of it, but I think it's called Doors and Passages. And he talks about the introduction of the corridor, and how the introduction of the corridor was the beginning of Puritanism, in a way, because it used to be that you could walk through rooms and you come across whatever you come across. And that was why the door opened against a wall, so the people inside would know when the door was opening and had time to prepare themselves for the unexpected visitor, whatever. And it's a fantastic essay. But what I'm wondering, it's partly to do with Yvonne's comment about the generosity of volume. He's talking about big houses. I'm wondering, is there something about a critical mass of people within one building which gives a sense of privacy, that when you go into a small house, you feel you're on top of people. When you think of, say, the Georgian house that George in Dublin, where you would have 5 floors, each of which can now be an apartment, there's something about at a certain moment when there's maybe 15 people or 20 people, that there's more of a possibility of living together than when there's 6. At what point are you claustrophobic? And we're doing a project with students in Venice, and we're asking them to break the typologies and think, could they appropriate a grand staircase, and how many apartments could you, if you were squatting, how do you think, when you think about the way that people squat in all kinds of spaces, whether they're industrial spaces or spaces that have come free, or maybe we've become too prescriptive, was the word that you've used, and the tight fit does not allow for the organic change that comes about in life. But I love the focus and the clarity of approaching a very complex issue, but somehow presenting it in a way which asks very clear questions indirectly by virtue of the clarity of thinking.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shelley, and it is time to move on. Ruth, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
So, thank you again to Ruth. Last year, the dissertation judging panel awarded 2 medals. So we will now hear from the other 2019 dissertation medal winner. Naomi Rubra was nominated by the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL, for her dissertation towards effective architectural practice. Lessons from Eldhorn Housing Estate, written during her part 2. Naomi, the floor is yours.
So I think you'll probably pick up on a theme across both our theses, and this is one of intergenerational and social resilience. My contribution to this mission, if you like, is part history, part opinion, and part practice, as I hope this story demonstrates an attempt, albeit late in my education, to challenge architectural practice, and more specifically offer a critical reflection into what people need to live a good life, and how a better understanding of these needs can inform and improve what I am calling effective architectural practice. Effective in that there are lasting, wider beneficial outcomes for health, wealth, society, and community. I hone in on housing, chosen not only because of its centrality to our shared experiences of everyday life, but also due to its ubiquity as an architectural typology that engages both private and public resources. We tend to bemoan the fall of human-oriented design born from the Second World War, elevating architects, planners, social scientists, and developers to collectively engage in the large-scale reorganization of everyday life. Where this worked well, the lasting benefits have been profound, and Bevan's legacy, championing neighborhood mix and prioritizing classlessness, is a famous one. However, it would be naive to suggest that architecture that met the needs of the people were consistent in quality, reception, or interpretation. A later focus on quantity of housing stock, for example, had qualitative consequences. The catastrophic collapse of Ronan Point Tower, a poignant illustration of a focus away from the user. Oh, my clicker's not working. Great. Ronan Point Tower. The Parker-Morris report and subsequent design guidance were very influential in shaping the architect's standardized image of the user as young, typically nuclear families. But what did this mean for those residents that did not fit the mold? Beyond economics, how did the architect's associations of class, culture, gender implicate residents' lived experience? Certainly, the contemporaneous work of Jane Dark in 1975 set out to explore this dichotomy between architects and the users and their estates. What information were they drawing on, and how did the architects use this information in designing public housing? Could this help explain the difference in intentions of the architects of council estates in London and the reactions of people living there? In her rich, very complex study, which I mulled over with her in her home in Oxford, I'll briefly summarise some of her key findings, was that she found the majority of architects' personal interpretation of family life echoed and reinforced this nuclear norm. Most tended to focus on the needs of families with young children as governing everything, and combine these with ideas of class and lifestyle. Design guides tended to support this, and the examples show the implications on women's experience both inside and outside the home appear to be incorporated into housing by a sort of remote control process. A regular example was the effect of the design guides for the estate street, advocating a strong sense of surprise, leading people through a space unpredictably and offering glimpses or a meeting place that would suddenly be revealed. But what of someone walking back late at night when an unwelcome surprise is not so welcome? It becomes clear to dark that a rationality gap exists between the architect and the user, being out of touch with those who design their buildings. The image or conjecture in the mind's eye of the architect was based largely on a set of assumptions that their professional training appeared to do little to remove. Her analysis is instructive for us, not only for its content, but for its timing. It offers us a snapshot of design methods in Britain on the turn of the neoliberal, with Thatcher's government undoubtedly accelerating a focus on the economy of public housing and asset into private hands. Today, with prominent politicians vowing to blitz poverty by demolishing 100 of the UK's worst sink estates for so-called improved housing, public housing has again become a lightning rod for a much larger ideological battle, raising Dark's query about improvement for whom and relative to what. Whilst there exists a genealogy to help architects, it is clear that a much more close and careful consideration of the user is needed to put into practice in order to change the paradigm of dysfunctional design methods. Initially on the part of the local authority, and now increasingly on the part of the developer, architecture intended to service the needs of the people has, in reality, been mutated by a remote and isolated set of assumptions of a good life, and further diminished in importance by market forces. The result we are seeing is little deliberation on the basis of design, its source, and the potentially incredibly harmful consequences. Moving on to the Elthorne housing estate confronted these damaging assumptions to me, and like many low-rise, medium-density estates Dark had interrogated, now exist along London's gentrifying frontier. As a resident, our future was precariously out of our own hands. I thought perhaps this unique set of freedoms which came with being resident designer student, I might help uncover what actually matters, to get to know my community and how we might offer our own agenda for development. In the words of Art and Architecture Collective Muff, whose approach rejects the idea that you can decide what can be done to a place if you're an outsider looking in, suggests if you're in the detail, you can look at what's possible across the whole strategy. I was nervous. You're not taught how to talk to the public about their community in a meaningful way. And I looked a bit nutty with a body camera notebook and unwavering persistence. But before long, interviews began flowing, fueled by an unexpected passing the baton effect, where one resident would vouch for me to the next. And with this recommendation came a degree of trust and openness. Over time, it revealed a neighbourhood dynamic, one which, due to many residents exercising their right to buy back in the 80s, consisted of a larger, older age group and their extended families. From many cups of tea came a body of increasingly specific and complex complications. Issues such as housing, maintenance, accessibility were heightened, and to understand what mattered and why, I'd need to evolve equally specific methods for questioning, from the scale of the home to the wider estate. A chair for engagement was one such way in. A spontaneous reaction following the 4th to 5th interview was 63-year-old resident Ophelia. Conversations around her restricted mobility due to osteoporosis turned to ideas for a solution, perhaps a chair to support her whilst working close to the ground or during meditation. And we worked through several iterations in MDF, a set of flat-pack pieces I built at school and brought to her living room for testing. Whilst ergonomic in its design, the specificity of resident requirements as seen through the design of the chair mimicked wider ideas of the workings of the home and ultimately the estate. I was asking on a basic level, does it provide stability, comfort, aesthetics, pride, convenience? And a well-designed chair in this context was indeed as much through its functionality as it turned into being a successful way to understanding a person. In fact, Ophelia's chair found itself alongside an assemblage of self-made, self-altered belongings and finely tuned domestic relationships, the satisfaction of each one coming in their use every day. The chair is one representation for honing the specific, a model for truly finding what matters and creating a type of solution, a strategy an architect could scale, rather than, as Dark discovered, a foundation of assumptions and prejudice. Similarly specific can be found around the home, observations I documented in a replica doll's house, each room mimicking the nuanced domestic spaces I had been shown, and came to symbolize a macrocosm of domestic knowledge-based practice relevant to our estate context, and one which I set out to present back to my interviewees in the form of a workshop. We held the workshop over the course of a day, with 22 residents of Elthorn attending. It was at Caxton House Community Centre, and the aim of our day was to build a storyboard that could help the residents illustrate a memory of Elthorn, originally from simple folded paper pieces. A corner of a space, just like the room of the doll's house, acted as our storyboard, and each took on different spatial arrangements in the estate. It may be a front door, a neighbour's wall, and importantly, they're remembered as happy, sad, lonely, busy, fearful, and many of these elements took on new articulations stamped by the makers themselves. Each story came to physicalize the seemingly mundane and everyday as something really extraordinary and unique, and the beauty and creativity of the stories gave many a motivation to pursue what was previously deemed as daunting, and by some a really difficult task. The making of images brought to life the user's imaginary. It was an attempt to value the kind of knowledge that is often marginalized or ignored. And the workshop realized what might be considered architectural in a highly codified way and an accessible way, and from which preceding propositional models at the estate scale sought to simulate. As feedback translated into an urban design strategy, its integrity would have to be continually challenged. Ideas for space and use highlighted in the workshop were here drawn out across the master plan through walking interviews. For example, when accompanying 70-year-old Laura on her daily walks, I gleaned incredibly specific disabling impacts of the estate on her. Such things as access, paving, lighting and rest stops, and their knock-on effects in terms of confidence and safety that might be felt by other older people, but also mothers and children. As a design method, falling into a person's ordinary rhythm cultivates an empathetic relationship with their experience of a place and highlights appropriate areas for improvement. For Laura, having someone tag along was pretty nice company, and as with all the exercises, I wore a small video camera to document the interviews and refer back to later. Our times together were nuanced and varied, prompted by the spaces we moved through. The practice succeeded in dislodging any feelings of preparedness on my part. Walking alongside Laura challenges the idea that effective architecture, or an indeed effective master plan, is something that can be designed and fortified by delineated lines and walls, but places its effectiveness in a much broader social context, one I felt particularly reliant on the contribution of others. Whilst detailed buildings did grow out of this process, testing accessible housing, community care and exercise across 3 sites of the estate, their tectonics, similar to their design process, asked how might the community lay claim to these spaces on their own terms, how might improved neighbourhood infrastructure support them to do so. Indeed, it did not escape me that it was because I had built a relationship and thereby trust with the residents before the interviews or workshop that enabled me to approach them and facilitate the collaboration in the way that I did. And whilst drawings were a favoured tool to present back to my tutors at school, on returning to the estate for regular crits, a model which could perch comfortably in the lap set up an accessible review. Using colour blocks to represent different programmes, we could discuss quite complex ideas such as cohabitation while shape-shifting the configuration of each building. At each step, the project set out to invert Marlowe's hierarchy of needs in a way, to give an alternative reading of the user which engages as much with their social, emotional and political relationships to an urban environment as it does with the ground-level physical features of a place. The in-your-lap review, akin to a chair or public workshop, or walking alongside one another, attempt to gain knowledge at the scale of the home, the street, the neighbourhood, putting the resident of our architecture back into focus and where an ethical aspect was absolutely necessary. In practice, the vision of Dark some 50 years ago remains to be fully realised, and I am aware of criticisms of how we fund in time and money such community insight work, but one to which I'd argue demands a much more systematic and longer-term view of economic and societal benefits. Would not spending more time upfront save huge sums down the line in tackling health and social consequences? Certainly this would call for greater attention to new methods, tools and ways of restoring the relationship between the public and the public service, the very stuff of architecture. And in the world of education, I join others in arguing that the master tutor and willing student would seem redundant. We must instead look to the site and its users as a critical basis for design. After all, if we are not teaching the importance of users in shaping practice, are we not jeopardizing effective practice? Thank you.
I'm just making sure my timer is off, and that was 13 and a half minutes. Well done. Sally, I am going to ask you exactly the same question. Why did this get a medal?
Well, I think this is a really good example of not just how research informs us, but how it demands that we look at our practice, so how it changes our practice. And I suppose that's my question to you, is in the research, it's clear that this is really a body of work, not just a traditional dissertation. You've looked at an enormous number of aspects of a particular field, particular area that you're very interested in, and you're embedded in and experienced in as both as a designer, but also an inhabitant. So what I'm really interested in, I think what we were interested in, was the fact that this was research for practice, and research that used practices as basis, but was continually in flux and dynamic. But I'm really interested in how it has changed your a personal practice and your approach to practice now at the very kind of outset of your professional career.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think on a personal level, it means that everywhere I go, I have to stop for a cup of tea now. But yeah, so that makes like getting around pretty slow. But on a professional level, I think that these principles are going to be at the foundation of what I believe in and why I'm wanting to be in this profession. I think that the lessons that have been taken from this project are going to be I think what's interesting is seeing where it's already being picked up and how councils are already beginning to take public, I'm not going to use the word, but engagement more seriously. So I think that's a start, but certainly we need to be demanding a lot more of ourselves and our tutors and our schools in order to be asking the right questions rather than necessarily the wrong questions. Yeah.
I think that's something you very clearly state is about challenging not just perceptions, but what we're taught, and to continually synthesize what you're finding out. I think that's really, really very, very clear in your work, but it's very, very articulately put. And the connections between people that you've looked at, including Dark, Muff, etc., is very, very clear in the work as well. So this is both design as research, but in terms of the depth of the research, it's exemplary as well.
Fantastic presentation. I'm trying to think of the name of the architect who, when she finished her education, was appointed as city architect for housing. I think it was, is it Tiziano Bilbao, or I think it was her. And my question is, what are you going to do now? I love the fact that you are speaking about challenging your tutors, challenging your schools, challenging our ways of practice, because we're at a time where we all need to do that. If I was to say to you, you can now do what you want, what would it be?
Okay, I have to be slightly careful because my new boss is in the room, so. But
do you have a boss? I don't think you would have a boss. An employer maybe, but not a boss.
You know what I mean. It was an Americanism. Yeah, so what would I do? I mean, I got this a lot, and even at school, I think I was getting a lot of, remember, you're on an architecture program. But for me, this is absolutely our built environment, and this is absolutely what's demanded if we need to truly build resiliently. We need to think about how we are funneling resources effectively. And I think we can do that when we truly understand the core issues on the ground level. So for me, this is an approach that applies to architecture, but this could become methods for teaching young architects. It could be a method for taking into estates and offering programs to support communities in regeneration. But ultimately, this is about the city and the estate and communities. And I think it's actually really relevant to what Ruth was looking at in a way, and it's this sense of intergenerational resilience and the fact that our society is shifting, and how do we understand that as a body of people in this lovely big building on the top floor. Yeah.
And could I ask, if you removed the word could, and if you were to just start, I suppose I'm just thinking it's partly to do with conversation we had on the bus this morning with some of the presidents. Where are we going and how do we change? And people like you and your generation and all these medalists and ways of thinking, in a way you could assume that you are in charge, not that you're waiting for somebody to say you could do this. But you assume the position that you need in order to do the things that you want to do.
Yeah.
Because that's what we need in architecture.
And I think now it's just beginning to become incredibly specific in the way I'm living my life and the opportunities I'm trying to learn about right now so that I can be best placed to tackle these problems. And I'm right at the beginning, so yeah.
Yvonne.
Yeah, I just want to say
Pressing the button.
I'm emboldened by hearing you and your colleague. You know, it's just fantastic to hear what you're doing. When I was coming here for these wonderful few days, and because I was only taking hand luggage, I had to choose very carefully what book I would bring. So I chose Respect by Richard Sennett. And Richard Sennett is an incredible person to read, because he was the son of, I think, a single mother, and they lived in an estate in Chicago, and his whole life then became, I mean, that's summarizing somebody's youth very quickly, but his influence in terms of architectural thinking is still being felt in terms of his writing. So when I hear you speak about what you have done, the number of things, one was Richard Sennett, the other was really something that we're passionate about, is that architecture is not the preserve of you know, the other or the rich or whatever, that what you're doing is seeing and recording the effect of presumably fairly decent design ideas at that time, but we really do have to check them and see the impact. And your colleague before, you could start a movement, the two of you, together, because you're saying, look at the, I mean, that's what, when that little Swedish girl with the yellow raincoat stands and takes on the world, she stands there with a kind of a benign innocence and just asks the bloody question, what the hell are you doing? So one is, I think that one of the things that we talk about a lot is that the industry and the advisors to government are all fossilized in the way they think. They give us the same thing over and over again. They give us the housing because you have housing, and the housing then produces the type of plans that forces people not to be flexible. And what is wonderful about hearing the two of you is that when you talk about your friend Laura, who goes on the walk, she's only a young chicken, she's only 70. She shouldn't have an empty nest syndrome and be lonely.
Yeah.
If she had a house that she could rent out 4 rooms, have 10 lodgers, have an affair with one of the lodgers on the
exactly.
night, she'd have a great life.
Yeah.
So this whole thing of having, you know, the house that's empty, and all the children, she said, you know, the children are away, and her house is kind of becomes a fossil of a time of her fertility. People live longer now, so we have to make houses that allow for affairs and staircases and life. So this, the last thing then, I'm not encouraging that, I'm just saying. The other thing that which you really touch on, is that you are hearing the silent voices. It's something that we really need to hear as architects. We are highly privileged as a profession, but we hear each other too much and we don't hear the other. And what I really admire about your work, that issue of the chair, of the moving, of watching, of using models to communicate, because the words that we use in schools of architecture, especially if there are lots of presidents of institutions here, that we have a vocabulary which can be exclusive. So what you're trying to do is to have toys, because architecture is so serious, we need to play with it. And I just want to say how much the two speakers, I admire you and what you're doing. But as Shelley says, take it now. Don't wait till you're about 106. Now's the time to do things. Put on that yellow raincoat, maybe it's a yellow t-shirt or whatever, but just you're there. You're highly intelligent, privileged. Just do it and change it, because things haven't been, they're not enough at the moment. And you're well able to communicate. Just do it out in the streets. Good girl.
Thank you. Thank you.
That's my first memorable quote of the day. I'm not encouraging, I'm just saying. My wife's grandmother lived with them, and she was forever, I'm just saying. I'm not criticizing, I'm just saying. So thank you, Naomi. And thank you all. I think we're going to move on now to our third presenter, who I would like to thank for having travelled from Singapore, especially to be with us today. The 2019 President's Bronze Medal, awarded for the best design work produced at RIBA Part 1, went to Annabel Tan from the Bartlett School of Architecture, UCL, with Wetland Frontier, a project that also won the inaugural RIBA Award for Sustainable Design at Part 1, and the SOM Foundation Fellowship UK. Annabel, the floor is yours.
Tackling the issue of urban resilience, the scheme is a speculative master plan that challenges the current approaches towards disaster prevention and landscape engineering in New Orleans. The proposal operates on multiple scales, from the strategic phased master plan to the physicality of the architecture, to address critical questions raised by the precariousness of cities in the face of climate change. The project is situated in New Orleans, a city which has been at odds with nature since its founding. Hurricane Katrina is just one example of this historic contestation which has explicitly shaped the man-made realm of the city, marked by towering flood walls, billion-dollar pumps, and elevated houses. The Lower Ninth Ward, where the project is sited, is interesting in that it is both environmentally and socially vulnerable. The Lower Ninth Ward is directly adjacent to the Bayou Bienvenue wetland triangle, causing it to experience the brunt of the hurricane. A decade after Katrina, this majority African-American neighborhood only reached a 39% return rate of its residents. The Lower Ninth Ward initially started as a community of runaway slaves who were drawn to the resources available in the nearby wetlands. As the wetlands flourished, so did the neighborhood as well. However, as the city began to augment the landscape by cutting canals across and erecting flood walls, the wetlands began to disappear, and the community, now literally cut off from the city, started to suffer as well. As such, the proposal aims to facilitate the regeneration of both the community and the wetlands, believing that they will flourish symbiotically with time. The scheme sits across the levee that separates the two, blurring the harsh boundary between people and nature. By tapping on the wetlands' potential economic, recreational, educational, and ecological benefits, the scheme both attracts, mobilizes, and retains a demographic that matures with restoration efforts. The scheme puts the restoration of this unique urban wetland as the cornerstone of value creation to attract long-term sustained interest from multiple stakeholders. The scheme consists of three axes shaped by programming. The ecosystem-dependent business model of nutrient farming becomes the initial magnet for new resident employees, jump-starting job creation and value creation in the area. As such, research labs, workshop spaces, and NGO headquarters are present to support this wetland restoration. Housing is built to increase land value and provide accommodation for these employees and volunteers, and also those attracted by this new way of life. A public park in the middle provides an avenue for education and recreation, increasing the value of the neighborhood in the eyes of other citizens of New Orleans. The project is conceived in 3 main scales, the largest being that of the master plan. The master plan matches outputs from human-generated activities to the needs of wetland restoration, which include the need for fresh water, new plant saplings, and sediment flow. For example, the large plant nursery beds illustrated serve many purposes at once: to house growing cypress saplings before they are implanted into the wetlands, to purify discharged greywater from houses nearby to be reintroduced into the wetlands, to serve as stormwater collection basins, and lastly, as unique social spaces. These underlying systems form the basis of the scheme's organization throughout the design development, always matching the needs of human and nature. The infrastructure does not fight nature, but rather accommodates its changes to cultivate a more sustainable relationship between people and nature. Plant nurseries, water-activated spaces, and collective water tanks underpin the scheme's restorative purpose and also act as an apparatus to read the environment. By allowing water management to become human-scaled and observable, a more personal, empowered approach to landscape engineering is created, challenging the brutal flood defense systems built around New Orleans. The second scale investigates urban resilience at a building level, focusing on the housing aspect of the scheme. Urban resilience is forged not only from disaster-proofing the architecture we live in, but also from the ties that bond us to a place. The typical practice in Louisiana to combat greater flood risk is to raise its single-family housing stock to increasingly greater heights. Going against this, the scheme proposes a dense communal living scheme that subverts New Orleans' approach to both physical and social resilience. The design progressed by adapting current disaster-proof technology to vernacular taste and habits of local living, creating sincere architecture that hopes to be a model for Delta urbanism in the region. As mentioned previously, the scheme is staged according to the growth of the wetlands and the people who are drawn to it. Naturally, as the wetlands flourish, so will the community housed. The changing demographics projected for gives rise to different housing types in the scheme that reflect the number and transients of the different target groups. The initial seed contains single apartments, co-living units, and volunteer hostels for the first few years of wetland restoration, involving employees, youths, and different cycles of volunteers. As inhabitants grow attached to this unique way of life, the scheme expands to provide more permanent living situations, such as family houses. The community grows towards the Lower Ninth Ward as people decide to move permanently and settle down, becoming integrated into the local community. Physical resilience of the scheme is founded on ecological principles of resilience in natural systems. In these systems, resilience is a spectrum of attributes: resistance, accommodating, adaptive, sacrificial, etc., not simply being permanently resistant to change. The structural strategy is the result of transferring these principles into a coherent built network of resiliences that respond appropriately to a gradation of natural changes. During 100-year hurricanes or severe floods, the floating core in each house unit floats up and allows inhabitants to ride out the storm with basic accommodation and facilities. In the case of a 500-year hurricane, the megastructure is built to withstand forces from wind, water, and debris. Sections of the houses and apartments are designed to sacrifice themselves in such circumstances so as to cushion the more integral floating cores and not reduce the structural integrity of the megastructure. Adopting a more diverse interpretation to resilience hopes to create a more sustainable and dynamic way to build. The third scale involves testing the materiality of silt from the Mississippi River to create sediment satellites that challenge highly expensive and harmful restoration processes like hydraulic dredging. The ambition of the scheme is to transform Bayou Bienvenue wetland triangle from a body of brackish open water to a dense vegetated wetland that is rich in biodiversity and self-sustaining. In order to achieve this, regaining the right level of sediment buildup is crucial. The speculated time frame of erosion and deposition of silt is synchronized with the length of stays of different volunteers, creating temporary inhabitation that then gives back to nature. The 3 different sediment satellites are stationed in strategic locations, each weathering and altering their immediate microclimate at different speeds. Architecture is pushed in its ability to become an ephemeral instrument to achieve a restored landscape in which the architecture itself serves a diminishing role over time. The type of silt facade is customized for each instrument depending on function and length of habitation. Erosion, transportation, and sediment deposition are crucial to the formation of wetlands. These natural processes were studied and mimicked to create a choreographed landscape of decay and growth that would minimize the impact of human inhabitation in the wetland and instead make it support the ecosystem. To achieve a design that's ambitious yet convincing, the decision-making process was heavily informed by material testing and one-to-one making using actual river silt. Different construction methods, from rammed earth to digitally fabricated tiles, and material composition were subjected to controlled erosion testing. The design of these sediment satellites also had to adhere to simple, accessible construction methods that would be easily picked up by the volunteers who live in the scheme. For the long-stay hostels, volunteers would be in charge of making the silt tiles and replacing those on the facade that had eroded. This prolongs the inhabitation period while achieving the goal of wetland restoration. Throughout all the scales that the project is developed at, there is an overarching theme of pursuing a more intimate and responsive relationship with nature, working with the delta condition instead of against it, embracing it instead of avoiding. Newcomers initially attracted to this pioneer community become rooted to the local neighborhood on the left and begin moving into more permanent housing, while cypress saplings planted by these volunteers begin to flourish in the newly laid sediments. After a decade, the scheme stretches outwards towards the wetlands and towards the neighborhood, blurring the threshold that once delineated human and nature. Family homes spill into the local housing stock and begin to take on the unique taste of New Orleans as the nascent community take ownership of their houses. Sediment satellites venture forward for the complete restoration of the wetlands, leaving behind fertile land for vegetation, but also a robust megastructure for future amphibious inhabitation of the wetlands, providing rich new testing grounds for further architectural investigation. The 1:500 model shows an overall view of the scheme, with portions of the scheme depicted in different scenarios it has been designed for, the future growth of it, flooding situations, and post-disaster scenarios. With climate change and the resilience of urban systems being pressing global challenges, my project, Wetland Frontier, ultimately endeavored to suggest a tangible definition for resilient delta urbanism. Through doing so, the project hoped to critique current approaches towards disaster management and redefine the interaction between people, architecture, and nature. Thank you.
11 minutes, yeah? Well done, thank you very much. I would like to start with the first question, which is actually, well, first of all, to remind people, this is third year, yeah? At the end of third year. And suppose I have to then ask, did you do all the work yourself? And how long did you work on it?
Yes.
Yes, of course you did. It's
work.
rhetorical. Yeah, but how long is it? Was it a was it a whole year project?
It was from January to the end of May. So we went to New Orleans in January with my amazing tutors in the audience, and then it was about 5-6 months of work.
Yeah. Yes, very good, very good. And yes, it's a tremendous amount of work, but obviously it's not quantity. Yeah, it's quality that obviously we're interested in. Yvonne, Shelley.
This is a great afternoon.
No, it's really fantastic. I really am heartened by just the fact of your intelligence and your imagination, and it's something that's dear to our hearts. So, as we said in our lecture last night, we're working with our students in the in the lagoon in Venice, and then, you know, the water in the Aqua Alta was to be here, and it was here, all in last November. And when you go into YouTube and you just see the storms, you realize, you know, the effect of when we build on floodplains, when we, in our country, when we, you know, in the Irish language, when something is called, you know, clún mac noise. Clún in the Gaelic means flood in the wintertime, lovely meadow in the summertime, don't build on it. But that's ignored because it's translated and then you lose the meaning. But in terms of New Orleans, what's really is interesting is that the mango, the whole, just the tiny bit that I know was that when the mango went, that was also breaking down the force of the sea. And what you have done, I think it's, first of all, I'd just like to say that what is interesting listening to the way you work and the way your two colleagues work is that you really do have to challenge the so-called, you know, the norms. We have a city called Cork in the south of our country, and with the best will in the world, because it floods, you know, some of the answers are so-called build a wall about here, and then that means as you walk on the street for the rest of the year, you can't see out. That the subtlety of what you're saying is about society and about dealing with nature being a moving force. It's not always violent. It can be very beautiful. So the thing of, the words I write down when I listen to you is the possibility of rebellious intelligence, the possibility of rebellious imagination. That, going back to the Venice Biennale again, Shelley and I chose the project done by Big on Manhattan, where they're working with local people because that was affected by the same storm. And that was really about putting a necklace of public park around the end of Manhattan. So on the times when things are okay, it's the pleasure for the residents. And then when a storm does come, that there is, if you like, architecture and infrastructure being civilized. And that's something that I take from your paper today, that architects, we do have to infiltrate the so-called engineering solutions to the problems of life. The earth is a creature, is a living creature, and has certain kind of personalities, and that we can learn to live together with the earth's moods and times. And what you've done, I think, is that 1 to 500 model is extremely beautiful, and the kind of sense of modifying and changing is really absolutely beautiful. There's one, it was just interesting, over Christmas I read I can't remember the name of the author, it's a piece of fiction, and I wouldn't advise you to read it, but it's called Where the Crawdaddies Sing. It's kind of a murder mystery, but it's set in North Carolina, and it's written by an environmental biologist. And what is very beautiful in the work of fiction is that there's a description of the bird life and a description of the impact of nature on somebody's, it's not what you call, it's a kind of a bestseller. So don't go out and buy it immediately, but you could secretly read it without anyone seeing you. But just in terms of that the earth is beautiful, it is powerful, and that is captured by your work. I really enjoyed your presentation. I can't believe that you're third year. But it is very interesting that as we stand here as different generations of architects, that it's really heartening to see that all of you have this talent. You know what I mean? You don't have to wait for, 4 generations of kind of architecture. That your voice is strong, your voice is clear, and you can do it. There are engineers making decisions that affect us now, and they shouldn't be allowed to do it. But because they're seen as, logical, architecture is an incredibly complex and imaginative, multidisciplinary, full of possibilities. And you have that gift. Not everybody is born with those gifts, so you have to share it. You have a responsibility now. And I just think I am emboldened. Thank you, President, for inviting Shelley and I to be part of this, and to the people who found these wonderful projects. And I'm sure for every one of these there are 10 or 20 others that you had to put by the wayside. That the world is full of your talent, and it's terrifically exciting to hear you all.
Shelley.
I have just 2 comments, which I think you made, which are quite radical. And one was, you said that the scale of observation would mean that control would happen. In other words, that people, by knowing what was happening, that they weren't waiting for the scientific forecast, that they would know what was happening, they could monitor what was happening and could respond to it. And in a sense, I think scale is hugely important, that we empower people to control their own lives. We've lost the power to monitor our own lives, and that somehow we empower people in order to do that. And just going back to the Venice Biennale, the other thing your presentation reminded me of was something Annabel Tan spoke about, and you spoke about the vernacular, that the vernacular in his description was when architecture grows at the same pace of the people. And I thought that was a really beautiful description of the vernacular, that it's not a style, that it is, of course, it's a way of constructing the world which relates to a culture, but that it's also to do with time, and that you have this organic way of a community growing at the same pace as the architecture, which is controlling the environment by virtue of its organic form, and by virtue of its thinking, and by virtue of its scale. So I think that's a really radical thing to think about. And I agree with Yvonne, it's fantastically encouraging to see you all. It's great. Thank you. Well done. Well, good choices. Yeah.
Well, I was going to ask the two members of the selection panel, David and Nikki, if you have any comments or observations.
Sure. Well, it came up on the screen, and it was comprehensive, and it was clear. It was innovative. It was beautifully drawn, and it was a powerful social vision. And you know, we tend to forget sometimes the social purpose of architecture as it gets subsumed in the desire to capitalise development. So what it was doing, of course, also, I think, is reflecting a whole conversation about the vulnerability of coastlines. It was drawing attention back to the abandonment of Louisiana in the post-Katrina period. And talking to Annabel earlier, you know, it's still essentially an abandoned community, but it's a resourceful community. So I think it also reminds us that the environments, the Gulf Coast communities, when it's more than physical reconstruction, it's actually about the social sustainability of what are some of the most poetic communities in the world. They're just extraordinary environments. I think I guess there's a question. You talked about it being a model for Delta urbanism, and I think it's a wonderful idea that you prototype an idea in a sense. But I just wondered whether, in the time it's taken since you completed the project, what shift you'd make in the model if you were trying to accommodate other cultural and geographical ecologies. I mean, you think about the wetlands of Bangladesh, for example. How would it change in a completely different cultural context?
You've just asked me to come up with a whole new project.
And here's my fee proposal.
It's permissible not to ask the question, so you have to think about it.
I guess it's just about taking the same kind of willingness to dare to challenge the norms in whatever situation you find yourselves in, and having a conversation with people who live there, with their vernacular knowledge, and then building on top of that to create something that picks out knowledge and experience from different kinds of environments all over the world to create something that is sincere to the people there, but then also moving forward architecture in a universal sense.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you. I am going to exert a presidential privilege, and I'm going to actually ask Yvonne and Shelley a question. Yeah? That I was elected on part of my, if you like, platform was a closer connection between academia and future architects and practice. And both of you, you've taught in various schools in Ireland and also in North America and also in Mendrisio. And there are quite a number of practitioners that, if you like, turn their back on, and get, completely absorbed in the business and practice of architecture. But you seem to balance the two. And I just wondered whether you would like to, if you like, stand and talk to the camera and explain why you think it is important to engage with teaching and the future generation of architects. Is that too big a question? No. No, just why do you teach?
We teach, I think we need it. We need to be stretched. We need to research. We can explore things without being commissioned. We can explore things with lively young minds who challenge us. We can enjoy when we see especially a maybe not so talented student, when we see that moment when it's like the light comes on and they discover something. And we love that moment of discovery and somehow being a part of being able to lead a student to that point where they can discover their own confidence in their own judgment and their own imagination. And what they need is just simply a guiding hand or a partner or some company along the journey. As architects, we're continually learning and beginning again. So we're eternal students. There isn't a moment when you understand architecture, when you know the answers. You never know the answers. So we're always asking questions with all kinds of people, not just students. But I think it makes no sense in our lives in terms of time. We get up early in the morning and arrive very home late at night, and we compress our lives, and so it doesn't make sense, but it's fantastically exhilarating. So it's like keeping fit, imaginatively and intellectually, and that's, I suppose, when you see the energy of these four people, number 4 to come, you can't but be energized by the freshness and the curiosity and the openness, and it's incredibly energizing. So.
I'd like to add to what Shelley is saying. We've had the privilege, like the President has said, of teaching in a number of institutions, and each one has a different kind of personality and a different theme. But essentially, we're practicing architects who want to share our experience so that the things we might have learned, we communicate, we try to communicate. But just like this afternoon, listening to your generation, you come with new and fresh intelligence, and you're mining into the world and is sharing with us. So the feeling that everybody in the audience is getting is what you get as an architectural teacher. We often quote Alejandro de la Sota, and he talks about, every time you teach, it's also about doubt. You don't know the answers to everything. We don't teach a style. We try to, if you like, enthuse a sense of the fantastic cultural possibilities of architecture and try to find ways of getting there, of exploring. There isn't a right answer. We have, as generations before us, have made mistakes, but we've also have made wonderful contributions. And something we believe totally in is that architecture is the new geography. Architecture is affecting how we respond to storms, how we live in cities, how we don't want loneliness. It is everything encompassed. And teaching in schools of architecture, I think there are places where the busyness of the so-called everyday life can be merged with the quiet, contemplative possibilities of what if. So there's the harsh reality of, you know, digging the foundations and finding the soil and making sure the rain doesn't come in and all those. And as the president keeps reminding me that the first time he talked to Shelley and I about receiving the medal, we were dealing with manholes and drainage. And the president likes to make sure that our feet are firmly on the ground and under the ground. And so much so, actually, that the project that we set in the Venice, in the lagoon, we called it, you know, really clearly, we called it below, on, in, and part of, because we wanted to talk about below ground and foundations, and we wanted to talk about how you access and what's above and how you keep the rain and the storms out. It's just an amazing profession, and I suppose sometimes, as Shelley's saying, it's hard to get in a plane or be very bad in terms of our carbon footprint and go to other places. But it's not just ourselves and it's not just students, it's also our colleagues. We're here in an institution. You've been lauded by your judges here to say that your standard is excellent. So you're brought out as a kind of representatives with that kind of thinking. I think institutions like the RIBA and institutions of architecture around the world are trying to hold on to the valuing of architecture as being of cultural importance. It affects everybody's lives and we're highly privileged. So I think that teaching is really that kind of dialogue between practicing architects, between institutions, between younger people, and we really have to keep looking at the mistakes we make and looking at the things that have survived. And what's interesting about the last presentation, where the house as the storm is coming, that you get into the thing that either floats or goes up, or, you know, we're not trying to pretend that nature isn't a force. And I think that thinking is a force, and imagination is a force, and schools of architecture are places of all these satellites of thinking.
Brilliant. We have one more presentation. Thank you very much. It is, I was referring to presidential privilege. I was being described as bold last night. And Denise Bennett, I believe, is in the audience. And Denise once said, when Alan asks you to do something, it's hard to say no. So thank you for indulging me. It does mean that we won't have many questions afterwards, but I thought, what better than having Yvonne and Shelley talking about the connection between practice and education, I think. So thank you. So we come to our last presentation. We move on to the fourth and final presentation of this year's CRIT. That word again. The 2019 President's Silver Medal awarded to a design project produced during an RIBA Part 2 course or equivalent in the case of qualification not validated by the RIBA, which is the case in this year. The 2019 Silver Medal went to Surface Tension, Blueprints for Observing Contamination in the Sydney Harbour Estuary, nominated by the University of Melbourne, Australia. And we are delighted that Victoria accepted our invitation and was able to come and travel over from Australia to join us today. Victoria, the floor is yours.
Sydney Harbour is one of Australia's most significant biodiverse estuaries. It is also one of its most contaminated. For over 6,000 years, the estuary formed the watery spine of the Eora Nation, a shared neutral territory for surrounding Cadigal, Wallamadigal, Wangal and Camaragal clans. Across 230 years of colonial occupation, the topology of this fragile environment has radically transformed. Wharves, shipyards, and maritime relics now define a highly modified shoreline. Artist Emily McDiven describes how the actions of colonists have disrupted the delicate ecosystem that Eora fisherwomen preserved for millennia. Oh, here we go. Oh, there we go. There is a dichotomy at the heart of Sydney's identification with its famous harbour landscape, appearing where relic infrastructure has modified natural shorelines. On the one hand, these sites stand as a testament to a maritime trade that once sustained the city, and on the other, they represent the destruction that industry wrought upon the estuary environment. My project, entitled Surface Tension, set out to consider ways in which the fragile ecosystem of the Sydney Harbour estuary may be rehabilitated within a context of post-industrial degradation. It proposes a collection of marine observation facilities across 3 sites of post-industrial instability. These sites are the proposed Western Harbour Tunnel, the working shipyard at Goat Island, and the former Naval Training Depot at Snapper Island. A survey of anthropogenic stress in the estuary formed a startling reminder of the way in which we continue to modify the environment. Extensive shoreline reclamation has resulted in the depletion of more than 80% of rocky intertidal habitats, whilst microplastic debris is accumulating to unprecedented levels. Most startling was the revelation that Sydney Harbour bears a toxic underlay of heavy metals and dioxins that is so dispersed along the benthic seafloor it is impractical to remediate. A current plan to construct the Western Harbour Tunnel at the heart of the harbour threatens to dislodge 500,000 tonnes of contaminated sediment that will be dredged, dumped and capped below the water. Stirring a toxic plume in its wake, the results of this plan are best described by conservationist Rachel Carson as a calamity that will patiently dispense its devastation outside of our flickering attention. Within this map, you can see the proximity of Snapper and Goat Island from the proposed dump site of toxic sediment. With public access to these sites forbidden, architect Joanne Jakovich aptly describes these islands as post-industrial blind spots. At these sites, I have reconceived maritime relics as productive infrastructure that might help to draw attention to the continuing effects of anthropogenic stress within the estuary. 3 relic artefacts, the cardinal mark, the slipway and the vessel, are chosen as physical armatures for observation. As Professor Ian McCalman describes, artefacts possess the power to bridge disparate times as part of history's archive and fiction's imaginary. In this way, new significations for old objects emerge. Hundreds of buoys and cardinal markers assist safe navigation throughout Sydney Harbour. Using a combination of conical top marks, the cardinal mark indicates safe passage away from a site of underwater danger. In response to the imminent construction of the Western Harbour Tunnel, a fixed-point observation tower is proposed to signify the adjacent dump site of dredged, contaminated sediment. The marker is positioned beside a 40-metre deep depression in the harbour seafloor, currently earmarked as the site for contained aquatic disposal. It will serve as anchor for a series of monitoring devices that will continuously observe for threat of contaminants leaching into the water column. Rising 15 metres above the high tide level, 2 conical top marks indicate a northern cardinal passage for passing vessels. In varying ways, the formal qualities of this structure draw from a collection of mast-like artefacts. Here, the tapered silhouette of a lighthouse has been flipped on its head and points downwards towards the hazard below. The purpose of this tower is to draw attention to the concealment of contaminated material that lies below the surface. However, there are many other sites across the harbour where anthropogenic actions are continuing to impact upon the fragile ecosystem. As Gavin Birch, a geoscientist from the University of Sydney states, the interactive effects of stresses on ecosystem functioning are still largely unmonitored. In 2016, Birch and his team proposed an unrealised project entitled the Sydney Harbour Observatory. Their vision was to collect in real time information about the health of the harbour through a network of carefully deployed marine sensors. This was intended to be made available to researchers and the public to help mitigate further estuary contamination. The following 2 proposals illustrate a continuation of Birch's vision and find opportunities for the renewal of degrading maritime relics at Snapper and Goat Island. A slipway affords the transition of a vessel from sea to land, supported by a system of cradles and winches. Goat Island sits to the southeast of the proposed Western Harbour Tunnel and bears the last industrial era shipyard in Sydney Harbour that is still in use. In 1901, the island was claimed as headquarters of the Maritime Services Board, and for over 80 years was exploited as a shipyard for the maintenance of its fleet of vessels and tugs and dredging ships. In 1994, Goat Island was transferred to the New South Wales National Parks, which saw the functional purpose of its workshop facilities significantly decline. And while a private leasehold remains at the shipyard, many of its wharves have collapsed. This proposal reconstructs the collapsed broadside wharf to its former working length to provide a new repository for the collection of microplastic debris in the harbour. The magnitude of risk posed by microplastics remains largely unknown, and there is currently a lack of material and spatial data sets available. Here, the functional qualities of a slipway are reconsidered to support the retrieval of plastic debris slipped from the water for collection and observation. The reconstructed wharf promenade stitches together a datum of new structures amongst the existing shipyard facilities currently in use. In this drawing, blueprints indicate instances where decay open opportunities for renewal. A survey of site reveals the complex layering of land use over time. Irénée Scalbert describes this method as one by which the architect interrogates the materials in his treasury, where ends in previous projects become means in the next. A new depot and docking station for the arrival of debris trawlers is proposed at the northwestern end of the wharf, recovering the footprint of a former coal loading platform. The tapered form of the docking depot extends downwards towards the existing shipyard, with sloping channels for hauling nets in and out of the water. Inside the depot, a sight line towards the Cardinal Mark Observation Tower bisects the building to form an open passageway, creating views toward the beacon of concealed contamination. Once collected, marine debris is transported for storage in cradles along the 150-metre length of the wharf. The movement of materials and pedestrians occurs along two discrete promenades to avoid disruption to existing shipyard activities. This elevated promenade serves to prop and brace existing structures along the wharf. Here it extends to provide shelter to the historic covered slipway, a fragile timber structure that is now the last of its kind in the harbour. At the southeastern end of the wharf, a storage repository is proposed within the empty bays of the former Maritime Services boat workshop. Trolling nets are winched into large frames for storage of collected plastic debris. In this context, collected materials may be viewed as a growing data set of accumulated anthropogenic material, remaining for public display until debris is recycled. I envisage that by providing a facility to collect, analyse and store microplastic debris, we may begin to understand more about the material composition of anthropogenic material in the harbour. Here, the Goat Island Wharf is renewed with an additional signification. A vessel is defined by a strict arrangement of decks and passageways, ordered from bow to stern. The seaworthiness of a vessel relies on the material stability of its hull, requiring continual repair and maintenance. Snapper Island sits to the southwest of the proposed Western Harbour Tunnel. It measures just 70 metres in length, and the island is the smallest in Sydney Harbour, yet the most radically transformed. For millennia, the site was a rocky outcrop, colonised by oysters, characteristic of an intertidal reef habitat that was once widespread across the estuary. In 1930, Snapper Island was carved, cut and reconstituted by naval officer Leonard Forsyth, who leased the island to create a voluntary sea training establishment. Forsyth exerted his influence in a violent process of land reclamation, sculpting a new island edge with stone seawalls that were shaped to represent the bow and stern of a ship. 12 structures were arranged to mimic the layout of a naval vessel, with fly decks and galleys concealing the reef habitat below. The training school ran for less than 50 years, and since 1980, the site has been inconspicuously degrading. Ownership of the island has been transferred to the Commonwealth, and there appears to be a perpetual lack of funds to conserve or remediate the island. In this proposal, Snapper Island is restored as vessel, an observation facility to stimulate the regeneration of depleted intertidal habitats. A collection of observation structures reconstruct lost fragments of the former training depot, while the foundations for a new biogenic reef are prepared below, repairing the island's unstable shoreline. A composite of foreign materials, corrugated iron, timber, lead paint, and asbestos fragments sit atop deposits of reclaimed fill in the fore and aft ends of Snapper Island. Illustrated here, The stone seawalls that Forsyth constructed more than 90 years ago are beginning to break down and threaten to expose contaminated surface soils into the harbour. The construction of a new oyster reef is proposed as a method for the stabilisation of contaminated fill. It is envisioned that this would be cared for by volunteers of the Sydney Harbour Observatory. Biogenic reefs are widely used as natural breakwaters to stabilise eroding shorelines. Here, biodegradable nets are filled with recycled oyster shells to fortify the unstable edges of the island. Over time, new oyster larvae will encase this framework and stimulate the accretionary growth of a larger rocky reef ecology. In place of a dilapidating gymnasium, a new fly deck is constructed for the observation of intertidal habitats below. In this littoral zone, recolonising mytilids, mollusk and algae would be submerged and exposed by the tides, observed unobstructed from above. This structure retains the proportions of Forsyth's deliberate arrangement of buildings upon Snapper Island, and arriving vessels are afforded new opportunities to access the site. At the aft end of the island, an observation tower is constructed upon the site of the former signal station, recalling the lost mast of the HMS Sydney that once stood in this location. A tall, upright spar recreates the silhouette of this lost artefact, providing a new amenity for water storage and a deck for the observation of resident seafowl, including the silver gull, swallow and currawong. Considering the renewal of Snapper Island as a vessel requiring continual repair, History's archive has been brought into the cultural currency of the harbour today. Non-human actants, namely oysters, re-emerge as resident occupants of the site and resume their place in the estuary landscape. It is envisioned that these sites would be managed and occupied by the consortium of scientists who envisioned the framework for the Sydney Harbour Observatory. With the development of infrastructure for observing anthropogenic in the harbour, we may better understand, adapt to, and mitigate the slow but alarming effects of contamination on the fragile ecology of the estuary. Many of these effects lie below the surface and beyond our immediate attention. Layered landscapes such as those found at Snapper and Goat are repositories of public history and provide tangible evidence of materials of past lives and land use across time. This conceptual framework provided a set of parameters by which to consider blueprints for the renewal of degrading maritime relics in Sydney Harbour today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yvonne and Shelley, do you have observations or comments?
This is a great afternoon, really enjoying it. And congratulations to the judges for finding these people and putting them before us. I'd like to just talk about some of the drawings as well, those absolutely beautiful sections, they're just gorgeous things in themselves, that the drawing as part of architectural history is really something that's beautiful to see, and also that you're dealing with below ground, below water, I mean. In terms of, it reminds me of last night when we were at our lecture, we were talking about one of the presidents of Ireland, and then was High Commissioner in the UN, and then came to an architectural exhibition in the Biennale, tore up her script she was going to talk about at the discussion on the Earth as Client, because architecture, having seen what architects do, it was a kind of a repository of hope. And that when I look at what you're doing, we love Utzon, and our image of Sydney is always the opera house, and that architect's ability to deal with the symbolism of a nation by a building, and then the intimate, that now you're able to look at this extraordinarily changing landscape between sea and land, and in terms of history, how do you make people aware? I mean, that whole issue of tiny particles getting into the sea and getting into our food and affecting us, it's a worldwide phenomenon. You have it in this beautiful harbour. I think it's a beautiful piece of research. I think the two islands, by raising public awareness about issues and being able to go there with many generations, it's a kind of I'm sure you make these buildings and 3 or 4 generations on a Sunday afternoon or whatever are able to see the same thing and learn from it. I think it's a very beautiful
presentation. I wish you well. I hope that you change the way we think about harbours. I hope that you are nudging people. I think that what comes across from what your project describes is really that civilizing infrastructure is really an area that maybe, going back to the President's questions about schools of architecture, that bridging that gap, that we don't just do kind of nice buildings over in the corner. We challenge the engineering, the biological issues that face the Earth, and that your project takes on those grand, large-scale issues. Thank you.
Thanks.
Could I just ask a question? You said using drawing as a critical method for historical and material exploration. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
I think that throughout the project, drawing became a method for me to document the wide range of research that I was doing and the disparate kind of nature of the sources that I was looking at, from kind of field observation to archival research. And by overlaying all of those kind of sources of information into drawn kind of artifacts, it was a way for me to kind of coalesce all of the thinking I was doing, and it also kind of formed like a foundation for then thinking about how I might intervene in these already very layered landscapes. And so I guess drawing was the vehicle by which I was able to kind of move through each stage of historical research and then thinking about how, what kind of contribution I could make into this existing kind of very complex landscape.
Because it reminds me, we read recently an article about Leonardo da Vinci, and we did a medical school in the west of Ireland, and there was a heart surgeon who went to some amazing exhibition of Vinci drawings, and he kept studying and studying and studying these drawings, and he was performing an operation one day on the heart operation, and he knew that there was some problem in the way that, I can't remember I was going to say the technology of it, I can't remember the details of it, but there was something in the Leonardo drawing which made a connection between one of the arteries and another of the arteries that he was exploring. And he described it as being like the pith in an orange skin that Leonardo had picked up in the way that he had made this drawing. And it gave the surgeon insight into how he would make his operation. And he decided not to remove things they were usually removing, but leave it there because it was performing a function. So the way that you draw the biology of the bay, did that draw you into another understanding of the interconnection of species and structures and constructions, or what?
Yeah, definitely. I think that it what was an interesting concept that emerged for me throughout the project was this idea of a novel ecosystem, and that perpetually as we continue to modify our environments, we're actually creating new environments that are these kind of complex enmeshments of human-induced kind of interventions on the landscape. But people often forget that the existing kind of ecologies that exist in those environments, they have to adapt and kind of become enmeshed in that new ecology. And there is this enmeshment that you have to engage with. And when you intervene or add something else into that kind of context, I became aware through this process of drawing that I was actually adding to that ecology, and it made me think about what impact I was going to be having on that new novel ecology that is continually evolving.
I was going to ask the panel of judges, David and Vicky, was there any comment on how this rose to the top?
Yeah, I'll just say a few words. I think that Victoria's project spoke to us really quietly, but with a really loud voice. I think the judging panel were really taken in by the very thorough and detailed analysis, research, and then, as you say, the generation through drawing of really big pieces of work, but which had a lot of modesty about them, and the sort of strength of will to question what our own human endeavours had done in the past, and question how we should be dealing with those in the future in a way that was done in a very clear voice, but again, a quiet voice, which was something that I think made it actually stand out in the group of work.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you. As I explained, I took sort of the President's initiative. I had a choice to make. Do I allow for questions from the floor, or do I have Grafton talking about the connection between practice and education? So I chose the latter. So hopefully you appreciate that. For that reason, we were programmed to finish at 4 o'clock, and so I'm going to bring the event to a close, if you don't mind. I was going to be mischievous and say, where is your colleague? Yeah, in the audience, but I'll not do that. Yeah. So it's a shame that we have to draw this event to a close, as we could go on discussing these projects and the dissertations for hours. Before we finish, I would like to invite you to visit the President's Medals exhibition, which is below us, considering we're on the top floor. It's the only way it can be, which is on the display in the practice space on the second floor. And we appreciate the diversity and quality of work produced by the next generation of architects that you can see there. I would like to thank ARPR, designers and manufacturers of furniture with close links to the world of architecture, for their support of the RIBA's awards programme. I would also like to thank the awards and education teams for their collaboration on this event, and in particular John Paul Nunes and Gillian Harrison for organising this event. I'd like to thank you all for coming today. I'd like to thank the panel members, our esteemed guests, our members of the judging panels, and please join me in a big round of applause to congratulate everybody. Thank you very much indeed.